Good morning, everyone. My name is John Mayo. I am a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown University in the McDonough School of Business. I am also the executive director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, which is our host for today. We're thrilled that you could join us for what I think promises to be a very interesting and worthwhile discussion. I say it's interesting and worthwhile. It's not just my opinion. We were overwhelmed with a number of registrants, well over 120 registrants for the event. And notably, that's too many to fit on a screen here, but notably it is from a wide cross-section of folks, both from academia around the country, the executive branch, the Hill, regulatory agencies, NGOs, the business community, more broadly civil society. So we're thrilled by the diversity and the breadth of the expertise that you will bring to this discussion. In that regard, let me say that like all Georgetown on the Hill events, the goal here is to encourage discussion, debate, dialogue. So if you have questions that occur to you during the course of the panel discussion that we're going to have, please go ahead and just enter those in the chat room. We'll reserve some time at the end of the discussion to open it up for more general Q&A. So today, what we're doing, just to put this in context, is having a Georgetown on the Hill event in which we bring experts to Capitol Hill, in this case, virtually, to discuss issues that lie at the nexus of business and public policy. Today, what we're going to do is explore a set of issues that we began last time in this same series, looking at new and emerging business models and the evolution of business strategy and antitrust. The last discussion we had was fascinating. It's on video on the website, on our website, so please later go back and take a look at it. It really is worth taking some time on. Today, what we want to do is to dig in. We want to dig in on issues on the subject of pricing models, what are the competitive drivers of the pricing models that we see emerging and succeeding in the marketplace today? How might these pricing models be evolving over time, especially, let's say, in the high-tech sector? What are the consumer implications of these pricing strategies and models? And more generally, do the pricing models that we observe raise antitrust issues? And to the extent that they raise antitrust issues, are the issues that they raise specific and sort of random, or are sporadic, or are they more pervasive? And so those are all subjects and more that we'll talk about. We have a marvelous set of experts on business law and economics here. We have two moderators for today, both of whom are subject matter experts in this space. Let me introduce them, and then we'll turn straight away to the panel. The first moderator is my colleague and co-author, Jeff Macker. Jeff is a professor of strategy and economics here in the McDonough School of Business. He is also the academic director for the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. He received a PhD in business and public policy from the Haas School at the University of California, Berkeley, as an MBA from the Tuck School at Dartmouth, and a bachelor's degree from Michigan. He is widely published in competitive strategy, management of innovation, technology, and more generally regulation and antitrust. Our second moderator is Mark Whitener, who's an adjunct professor of competition policy in the McDonough School and a senior policy fellow here at Georgetown in the Center for Business and Public Policy. Before accepting the position at Georgetown, Mark was a practicing antitrust lawyer, overseeing all of the antitrust work done at GE, where he was the Global Executive Counsel for Competition Law and Policy. Prior to joining GE, he was the Deputy Director at the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Competition. I should also say that Mark and I are co-authors of a recent paper on the welfare effects of vertical mergers and their remedies. Now, finally, let me mention two things. First, Commissioner Wilson, who was scheduled to offer some opening remarks today, is unavoidably unable to be here, as the FTC had the temerity to schedule a business meeting at exactly the time that we're having this event. So unfortunately, she will not be here. Secondly, one of our panelists, Corinne Wong-Irvin, experienced a health issue yesterday. We're told that it is not too terribly serious, but it certainly knocked her out of the ability to participate today. We certainly wish her a speedy recovery. Now, with that said, I have every confidence in the world that with the expertise that we have in the room, both on the screen and in the audience with you, that we'll have a very rich and fulsome discussion today. So with that, let me turn it over to Mark and Jeff.
Great. Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the program. In this particular Georgetown on the Hill series, we've been trying to pull together two threads. Antitrust scrutiny of business activity on the one hand, and on the other hand, the underlying strategies and tactics that drive business activity and that sometimes generate antitrust issues. Now, these two worlds acutely affect each other, but typically they engage with each other after concerns have arisen and typically investigations have been launched. So in this series, we're trying to weave those threads together a bit, explore the underlying business strategies that sometimes raise antitrust issues, understand those strategies a little bit better, and understand how antitrust fits or doesn't fit with some of these issues. So we have a great panel for this discussion. I'll introduce the other panelists and then I'll turn to some sort of agenda setting remarks. Andre Hagiu is Professor of Information Systems at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. He's a leading expert on platform strategy and business models. Prior to Questrom, he's taught strategy at Harvard and MIT. He advises and invests in startup companies and consults with firms in turning their platforms into reality. Andre received his PhD in economics at Princeton University. Dan Rubenfeld is professor of law at NYU and professor of law emeritus and professor of economics emeritus at UC Berkeley. He's published articles on antitrust and competition policy and a range of other issues, written 2 textbooks. He's consulted for private parties and for the FTC and DOJ, among others. From June 1997 until December 1998, Dan was Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust in the US Department of Justice, and he received his PhD in economics from MIT. So let me begin with some background comments on the topic that we're focusing on today, which is pricing strategies. And I'll sort of do a little overview really of just how antitrust has looked at a range of pricing issues over time. Then we'll turn to Andre and Dan for some initial comments, followed by some moderated discussion led by Jeff and by me. And we will leave time at the end for comments and questions from the audience, so please think about questions you'd like to ask. So pricing is perhaps the most fundamental concept in economics. If firms produce goods and services, markets and competition produce prices. Yet the idea that prices are invariably revealed through Adam Smith's invisible hand, as if by magic from the interactions between buyers and sellers, doesn't fully capture the range of pricing approaches that we are actually seeing in the economy. Now, some pricing methods we observe today may seem novel and sometimes complex, but a recurring question for our discussion today is, to what extent are they actually new? Providing goods at zero nominal price for free is as old as a merchant in the town square offering a free apple to attract customers to try his produce. That same merchant may engage in a form of package discounting by offering a baker's dozen, or by providing bundled pricing when selling a basket of different fruits and vegetables for a discount. Or the merchant may engage in loyalty discounting when providing a better price to repeat customers. Even the idea of zero pricing as a way of creating a network of buyers and sellers has roots in some once common products like the Yellow Pages. Some of us are old enough to remember those bulky paper books that were distributed for free to thousands of buyers containing information about thousands of sellers, and that provided significant value to both. A second question we'll be exploring, regardless of whether some of these pricing methods are really new or evolutions of prior practices, is do they raise antitrust concerns? And if so, when? When can a pricing method go from reflecting the essence of competition to actually harming competition and consumers? Now, antitrust law has developed some pretty clear guideposts to frame this discussion, reflecting the importance of avoiding undue interference in market functions while identifying areas of legitimate concern. So among those guideposts, first, antitrust has been viewed as not about price regulation or indeed about regulation at all. Antitrust authorities are law enforcers, not regulators. Nor does antitrust condemn monopolies or monopoly pricing as such, but only anti-competitive conduct that creates or enhances monopoly. And these are principles that have evolved over time, including in Supreme Court decisions, many of them commanding large majorities or even unanimous decisions. So high prices that result from legitimate success in the marketplace have been viewed as something to be tolerated, even encouraged, as an incentive for risk-taking and innovation that may have led to that success, and to allow markets to work by attracting entry from new competitors. At the other end of the spectrum, antitrust doctrine has recognized that low prices are typically the desirable outcome of vigorous competition that benefits consumers. And they should be subject to antitrust intervention only when there is a clear risk of durable harm to consumers. To ensure that pro-competitive discounting is not impeded, antitrust has set up some more strong guideposts for challenging price discounting as unlawful predatory pricing, requiring, among other things, below-cost pricing that is likely to eliminate or marginalize an equally efficient competitor, allowing the predator to recoup its losses and harm consumers by raising and sustaining prices above competitive levels. Antitrust has developed frameworks for analyzing other sorts of pricing, such as multi-product bundled discounts and loyalty discounts. Here again, the touchstone has been that markets are allowed to function and competition is allowed to play out with antitrust intervention limited to cases where it can be established that what may appear beneficial to consumers is actually harming them in the longer run. So this inquiry of separating legitimate or pro-competitive practices from anti-competitive ones requires, I think, first, a deep understanding of the business conduct at issue. What's the underlying business model and strategy that's being followed? What motivates the pricing or other methods that we're talking about? What are their likely effects on output and innovation? And ultimately, how will they affect competition and consumers both now and in the future? Now, I will close by noting that some of these fundamental antitrust principles that I just laid out are being challenged today, sometimes on broad ideological grounds, sometimes more narrowly by analysts who are seeking to identify instances where these templates, these guideposts may not capture all the anti-competitive conduct that one might be concerned about. So these and other issues will be the subject of our discussion today. And with that, we'll turn to Andre and then Dan to kick us off with their initial comments.
Okay, so let me set the context a little bit first, picking up from where Mark is. So Andre, in maybe about, say, 5 to 10 minutes, as indicated, you are an expert in platform and business models, and you've looked broadly at a variety of issues, including new products, the role of data and competitive advantage, and different strategies for sellers and competition among platforms or between platforms and sellers. But here, sort of give us a 5 to 10 minute overview of what are the important things we need to remember about platforms, business models, and pricing. And then I'll turn to you, Dan, after Andre has provided those initial remarks.
Sure, thank you. So I'll try to be neutral in the sense I'll just present a few pricing practices and then just without judgment, without any antitrust judgment, just pointing out that they're more and more widespread and I find them super interesting. So again, by way of background, I'm an economist, I'm an academic, but I also spend a lot of time evaluating and angel investing in startups, which, I mean, again, it has exposed me to a wide range. I mean, I find this super interesting, just like to observing like different pricing practices. So a few remarks. First of all, I think so what's been happening in tech over time, and it keeps, I mean, this is a trend that keeps going. The number and sophistication of price instruments has been increasing. Now, I want to go back. So I like Mark's point that, Mark's question, is it something truly new, or can we always tie it back to like very old pricing practices? I think it's mostly a matter of degree. So you can always, I mean, like there are these broad principles, I mean, price discrimination, bundling. So there are these broad buckets which have existed for many centuries, I guess, and you can always tie them back. But I guess technology has just made it possible to engage in these pricing practices with more and more sophistication. So I'll give you an example. So think about software, the evolution of software, and actually it's always fun to talk about video games, but it applies, I guess, to all kinds of software. So I don't know, when software was first created and sold, it was basically packaged software. So you would get, just like a shrink wrap packaged software. You pay one fixed price, you take it home, and you install it on your computer, and that was it, right? And that applied, by the way, to video games. Like for the longest time, video games, you just pay whatever, $50, $60, you take the video game home and you install it. Today, it's completely different. The world's changed completely. Most games, in fact, the most popular games, they're basically free. Like there's a version that's free to install, so they'll give it to you, and they try to get as many people to use it as possible. And then they sell in-game stuff. Now, the stuff can take lots of different forms. So there's like in-game avatars, like there's also in-game advertising. There's all kinds of things that you can sell in-game, which basically fundamentally serves the purpose of price discrimination. People, like there are some people who just like spend more time and they're more likely to, they're more engaged with the game. They're likely to spend more because they'll buy more things. If someone spends less time and there's less engaged with the game, they'll spend less. But everyone gets the game, right? And I would say to some degree, when that's efficient, just gets the game in the hands of more people, allows more people to get it. And then you can expect it also, obviously, it allows the producer to extract more profits. And I oversimplify this, but I can't emphasize how fundamental a shift this has been. Like even a few years ago, the idea of giving away very expensive games for free was pretty, like for a lot of game developers, seemed pretty crazy. Today, I think it's pretty standard practice. And in fact, even going forward, you will see probably even more. So I think everyone kind of understands this idea that you can sell in-game avatars or things like that. Now you can layer on blockchain and non-fungible tokens, so NFTs, and you can create other things that you can price. So like you can give stuff away for free, but then pretty much everyone can create it. You can give people the opportunity to create an NFT and like auction it off on some NFT marketplace. So I mean, there's lots of crazy things you can do going forward. So this was for video games. I think you've seen like a very similar evolution for software. So let's say professional software. There, of course, they're not going to sell avatars in the software. So I think the evolution there has been from pretty much like fixed price, shrink wrap, one price for everyone, to freemium models like SaaS models, like software as a service models, where maybe there's a baseline subscription and then there's like different tiers. So, there's whatever, like baseline, premium and pro or something like that. Others might, for example, they would also price another dimension. They would price, so let's say B2B software, they would charge per seat, right? So they're trying to get larger companies to pay more. So if you buy more seats for the software, like if you're a larger company, more people in your company use it, you'll have to pay more than a startup and so on. So I think that's, that's one direction. Another one that I didn't mention for consumer-facing software is obviously freemium model. So this would be things like say Pandora or Spotify, where you get the baseline version for free, but it comes with ads, and then you can pay subscription to get to no ads. So that's one. The other trend that I find interesting is so from bundling to unbundling to back to mini bundling. So it used to be when we thought about bundling in tech, maybe 10, 20 years ago, everyone thought about the cable bundles, and pretty much, there are all the criticism that cable bundles, like it sucks, it's like you're forcing people to get like 400 channels when they're only interested in a few of them and so on. So I would say even in that context, it's very important to realize, anyone that's done a little bit of like pricing exercises, you can very easily show that to some extent, yes, it does. It certainly allows the cable provider to extract more profits, but it's also it could be better for consumers, because by bundling together, you're actually giving consumers, so they pay one price and they have access to more things than if you sold the things separately. Now, another aspect of this, which I find interesting, is like, well, you used to have bundles, like, everyone says like it's inefficient. So what tech enabled is what's called the great unbundling. So you have like all these tech platforms that say, it's inefficient for people to get these bundles. What we want to provide is the ability for everyone to just get what they're interested in. So you get something like YouTube where you can basically choose, pick and choose, like I want this channel, but not this other channel, and so on. Now, what's interesting, what I see in the startup world, so like with marketplaces, for example, that's what tech, so digital marketplaces, that's what they enable. Especially when it comes to content, you get people like they're able to pick and choose what content they want. So like, I'll buy this piece of content, not this other one. However, what's interesting, like over the last few years, you see the emergence of like new companies, like new startups that are actually back to provide in bundles. So, I think everyone knows Netflix. So basically, like it is a bundle, it's subscription. But there's a few others. So there's Masterclass, there's ClassPass, there's a few other companies which basically say, pay one subscription and you get access to a bundle of content. So, again, this to me is like, it just speaks to the fact that there's some age-old both efficiencies and profit reasons for why bundling may be efficient. Now, it's interesting, of course, the bundles that you observe today, they're much narrower and typically like vertically focused than the traditional bundles, where like say the traditional cable bundle is like pretty much everything under the sun that has nothing to do with one another would be like under the same bundle. The bundles that you see today tend to be like more focused on, let's say, one vertical, one type of content. But nevertheless, again, it comes back to like pretty fundamental pricing principles that we've known for many years. Well, yeah, there are very good reasons to bundle. And I want to touch on one last thing, if you'll allow me. It just occurred to me like when we were talking about this relationship with antitrust, and it's something actually I was talking about to my students last night in MBA class. So we had this conversation about a ride-sharing company. So think about Uber and Lyft. And it's these are think of them as platforms between riders and drivers. And like standard marketplaces, the standard pricing they have is they charge a transaction fee. So by the way, of course, like all digital most of the digital marketplaces would typically make money off transaction fees. So they'll take 20%, whatever it is, 10, 15, 20%, I guess, in the case of Uber and Lyft, 30% for the app stores and so on. So in case of Uber or Lyft, it's interesting. So it's mostly 20%, but they have one interesting problem. It's basically everyone, I think everyone can relate to this experience. Everyone, so both us, the riders and the drivers, they multi-home in the sense that they're on both on Lyft and Uber, which is a serious problem for Lyft and Uber because they can't get any customer loyalty. Like it's very easy for for riders to switch between one and the other, and same thing for the drivers. And by the way, because of that, they have to compete on price and they're not making profits. So it's a very serious problem. Now, one thing that they came up with, which I thought was kind of interesting, a pricing strategy that's interesting, is, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that they started offering these monthly subscriptions. Now, this is a little bit different than traditional subscription, which basically says, pay it one time and then you have like free, all you can eat. Obviously, they can't do that because there's going to be a problem, right? So you can't have all you can eat. But what they say is pay a monthly subscription. I have no idea how much it is. I don't know, $15, $20. And then you get 20% discount of all the rides that you get that month. So again, I think this is an interesting, so there's 2 points here. First of all, I think it's an interesting example of the kind of like combination of subscription and price discrimination that you can do, which you probably couldn't do before, because obviously it requires you to monitor how many transactions. There's lots of interesting questions about, for example, how does the consumer know that they're getting a 20% discount in a world where the pricing is completely controlled by Uber? Like, how do you, like, they tell me that I get a 20% discount, but like, how do I know what's the baseline? I'm not sure exactly what the baseline, especially given that they can price discriminate across consumers. And number two, and this is, I think, there's a rejoinder here to policy. Well, part of the reason, the main reason they're doing this is obviously they want to get people to be loyal to their platform. So it's essentially the idea is like, once you pay the subscription, if I pay the subscription for Uber, well, I'm going to get discounts on Uber. So that makes me much less likely to go to Lyft, right? Now, again, they're desperate because they don't have loyal consumers, but you may look at this, I guess if you're a very overzealous regulator and say, haha, they're trying to lock consumers in through the pricing. Honestly, like the way I look at it is like they're experimenting. I actually don't think it's going to work very well. I don't think it's a very good strategy because at the end of the day, they have to pay for those discounts themselves. And I don't think it creates like long-term consumer loyalty. So, you pay the subscription this month, but next month you're back to, well, which one's going to give me a better deal? So I don't think fundamentally necessarily it alters consumer behavior. But I thought it's a neat example of, it's like trying different pricing strategies, trying to induce some consumer loyalty.
Andre, thank you. Just to summarize, so very interesting. Not only are some of the pricing instruments have been around for a while, but you're seeing an increase in software-enabled abilities to price discriminate. Bundling, the role of bundling to unbundling to mini bundling, mainly along a vertical format, and then the role of platforms in competition with each other when they face substantial customer loyalty kinds of questions. So now let's turn to Dan. Dan, you're obviously a leading person in antitrust and competition policy, law and economics, public economics. You've written extensively on the subject. You've consulted extensively to private parties along these dimensions. You've even written 2 textbooks. If you could do something similar to what we just asked Andre to do, give an economic view of antitrust and pricing, sort of highlight what you've seen over your long and distinguished career, and we'll take it from there.
I'd be happy to, Jeff. Thank you for those kind words. I would say that all the practices that Andre described are inherently pro-competitive. There's nothing purely anti-competitive about any of the new practices Andre described. In fact, it's just curious because when Andre was talking about video games and the fact that the business model stresses in-app purchases, we're all reading or starting to read about the Epic v. Apple case where the judge just came down with a 160, I believe, single-space decision. But it's taken for granted in Epic v. Apple that Epic's practices are fine. The question has to do with Apple's practices. So again, these practices tend to be, in general, perfectly legal. The question then becomes, when do some of these new practices run up against the antitrust laws? And most of my comments will focus on the federal antitrust laws, but I would just say in passing that a number of states have unfair competition laws, and I'm generally, I would say, I view those as either lukewarm or perhaps critical from my point of view, because unfair competition laws don't really have the same background and history that we have with the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. So I'm going to focus now on essentially start with the Sherman Act, which would take a look at practices with firms that have substantial market power, or if we're talking about tying or the like, or have monopoly power or the ability to gain monopoly power, if we're talking about some other practices. And what I would say is my presumption is that these practices that involve free are legal, except I'm going to be looking for problems. And the first problem I would be worried about would be, do some of these new business models create a barrier to entry into some relevant antitrust market? In order to have a barrier to entry, you're going to have that's meaningful. You're going to have some market power to start with, and some of these practices could well create a barrier. And for one thing, we know in economics, at least we believe, that there never is a free lunch. So when you see something for free, you should immediately look for where the cost really is. And typically in the various forms of bundles and other practices, there is a cost. And sometimes that cost is to make it more difficult for a new firm to enter to compete. So I think access barriers are a real issue today. And it's particularly true with data. Data are in many cases ostensibly free, but they're really not. Having control over data, we've seen this extensively. Having control over data can be a problem. People wonder why the placement of data, or the sale of data, access to data, is so valuable to companies, and the answer is twofold. One is it can generate real competitive benefits for consumers, but secondly, it can create barriers to entry. So I always ask myself, where is the real cost, and is this cost a problem? All of this discussion is great news for economists, because what I'm really saying is there are very few rules that should be per se illegal, very few practices. Most of them are going to be rule of reason, which means you're going to have an economist delving into that. And I would say what's new for enforcement is we're looking not only on price, but we also are looking at quality, because often these practices that seem free change the quality of the products that are available. So we've got to think about quality. Economists have always understood that in the agencies, but there's never been much emphasis on thinking about quality. The other thing I would say is when we're looking at mergers under the Clayton Act, Clayton Section 7, when it looks like there's an acquisition that's going to relate to the availability of free goods, we've got to again ask ourselves what's really occurring. If you, for example, if you acquire data through acquisition, how will the data be utilized, and will the data increase barriers to entry? And I would say in some cases that can be problematic. My own personal view is that we need to take a tougher look at merger policy. I've looked at in my time either at DOJ or as a consultant, I've seen a lot of mergers that probably were good, were not anti-competitive, but probably didn't really generate substantial benefits. And I now think we just need to take a harder look to see what's the motivation of the firms when they're either doing an acquisition or just putting into place a new practice. And what I'm saying is a little bit counter to what people think, because people normally would say, why do economists have any expertise to understand documents and things that might talk about innovation? I would counter that by saying if underlying documents and materials tell you, help you understand the profit maximizing motives of the firms when they're engaging in these new practices, that will help us understand whether there are potential antitrust problems. So a simple example, which many people know about, was when we in the government were investigating Microsoft 20 years ago, leading to the case was US v. Microsoft. We were asking, and I was asking specifically, giving away a free browser. What's wrong with that? Free is good, is it not? Well, it turned out that the browser was being bundled in various ways with the operating system. Well, why is that a problem? And the answer is it creates a two-level entry problem. It makes it more difficult for a competitor to enter. Now, are we sure that's what Microsoft is doing or not? Well, I think we were once we saw the emails that Microsoft regularly sent around. And there was one important email, which the head of the Microsoft Windows operation basically says, you've told me to bundle the browser with the operating system, but it doesn't make any economic sense. And here's why. And Microsoft was very honest in its emails. I think nowadays maybe firms have learned perhaps to hide their real strategy. But my experience has been that we can learn a lot. I think if you're going to be running a business successfully, you can't continually hide what your strategy is. So we need to look and say, are these practices sensible? Are there less restrictive means of achieving the same purpose? And I'll just summarize by reminding you, the vast majority of practices are going to be perfectly legal. It's only going to be the rare case where a firm has substantial market power to begin with and perhaps is trying to monopolize the market, where we might see a problem. I would say 95% of the time, the kind of practices Andre's talking about are perfectly fine. The hard part for the enforcers are the fine of 5 or maybe 10% of cases which are problematic, and then to dig very deeply into them and do this full rule of reason analysis, which I think is almost always necessary. So let me stop there. I'll pass it back to you, to Jeff or Mark.
Okay. So I think a natural entryway is you both sort of discussed the data and the role of data, and sort of, Dan, you raised this issue of how will data be utilized, and does data in particular create an access barrier? So it's a natural follow-on into Andre. As sort of Dan suggests, paying with data might create entry barriers that puts incumbent firms in invulnerable positions. What does your research show, Andre, about the role of data as an entry barrier? And then are you seeing, by way of entry into high tech, into the high tech arena, if data is a barrier, is entry being deterred?
So as it happens, I do have actually a very recent working paper, which is data, network effects, and competitive advantage. So we look essentially at, how firms can accumulate competitive advantage with data. So a few observations. What we look at is at a duopoly. So two firms that can accumulate. So the more consumers the more customers they serve, the more data they accumulate, and of course they can price accordingly. I.e., in each period they can say, well, because I want to accumulate more data, obviously I internalize the fact that I'll price lower this period in order to get more customers, therefore more data, and improve my product. What's interesting, what's quite striking about this is what we find is again, this is a result from the paper. There's no distortion from efficiency if you allow the firms to price. So that's kind of interesting. So it says there's no per se, yes, of course firms are going to price accordingly, but precisely because all the firms can actually, they can discount. Well, the competition is pretty efficient. Now, you can still ask the question, we do look at several policy questions. You can say, well, what about, let's say, an incumbent and the entrant? I think this still applies. In our model, so we allow the two firms to be arbitrary, the positions of the two firms can be arbitrarily far from each other at the beginning. So one firm may have an advantage. Again, if the entrant knows that, let's say if it's technology, it's better. So therefore, if it got more customers, it got to a much higher point in terms of data, in terms of learning than the incumbent, it should be able to price accordingly. It should be able to give discounts. And I think I see this in practice. Yes, of course, we can take extreme examples. I think it's very difficult for any startup to go in and compete with Google search. I think we all recognize this, and it's very, very tough. Well, I'm not going to say that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just very hard. Yeah, they accumulated data for 20 years. I'm not sure that's whatever it is, 25 years. I'm not. So yes, in those extreme cases, for sure, it's very difficult. But I think what's important to recognize that there's so many, there's lots of different sectors, lots of startups that are entering sectors where data-enabled learning plays a big role. And frankly, in a lot of cases, again, there's some extreme cases like Google search, but there's lots of cases in which you might think, okay, well, there's an incumbent here, they have a large data advantage. The reality is there's always some interesting substitute data that you can get around to. Actually, I'll give you an example that we looked at in an article. So there was, it was speech recognition. So if you had looked at the speech recognition market, say 5-10 years ago, there was a dominant player. And the idea was by virtue of having accumulated and having served more data. I forgot what their name was, but anyway, they were dominant. What happened over time, and the idea was, well, if you want to compete with them, I just need to serve a lot of customers in order to get that data. So it's very difficult to compete with them. But what happened over time is because of the improvement of machine learning algorithms and the public availability of data sets, on which entrants can train their algorithm, like speech recognition algorithms, it actually became very easy. So the technology in some sense became a little bit commoditized, and it became actually pretty easy to enter and provide speech recognition software without having to serve, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of customers. And I think this is a phenomenon that happens a lot. So you may look today at the market and say, okay, well, this incumbent has a huge data advantage. But what happens over time is technology evolves, so the ability to extract data from fewer customers so it becomes possible. Second, there's lots of substitute data sets. There's always new data sets that are becoming public, so people can train it. So there's always ways around it. So I think the tendency, again, just seeing I see a lot of startups. I think the tendency is to overestimate how big these data-enabled learning advantages could be.
So if I can jump in now, a lot of what Andre says, I think makes perfect sense. And I guess I'm the person who's always looking for the odd man out. And but I will say, just by the way, Andre, Dragon software, the speech recognition software, to my knowledge, was designed by one of my Princeton classmates. So we both have Princeton ties, and it was initially sold for a substantial sum of money. But I think you're right. That's the technology's evolved greatly since that time. So let me give you an extreme example of where controlling data can be a problem. That would be many years ago when Nielsen, which is basically a data-oriented company, entered into a contract in Canada to basically get all the data from all the supermarkets. And that was clearly, in my view, and clearly in the view of the Canadian authorities, anti-competitive, because they're basically controlling access to all data that would allow one to enter and compete. Now, on the other hand, if you look in the US, just staying with Nielsen, Nielsen acquired Arbitron a couple of years ago. That's a TV rating portion of Nielsen acquiring the radio rating portion of Arbitron. And there, the acquisition, it needed a fix, as we say, but the acquisition made perfect sense because the ability to have access to all that data from Nielsen gave it a leg up, but in a strong incentive to innovate and creating new methods of ratings having to do with streamed television shows and movies. And the agencies recognized that there was a fix to make sure there was no substantial barriers to entry, but the acquisition of data can often be pro-competitive. Where I worry a little bit is that we're seeing an important evolution where artificial intelligence can play a big role. And designing a good AI piece of software requires data. And so you want to think very carefully about how the AI might be used in certain industries and whether the data that are going to be used to basically streamline and design the AI software will somehow be controlled in a way that will limit competition.
So I have two quick reactions here, if that's okay. So I want to separate, I think it's a very important distinction that we should make. So it made me think of this, your Nielsen example made me think of this. I was talking about something very different. So there's two types of businesses. There's data aggregators. So I would qualify, so I put Nielsen, Bloomberg, credit bureaus in that category. Mm-hmm. So data aggregators means what they do is it's not like they accumulate data by serving customers and therefore improving their products. That's not what they do. What they do is like they go to whatever the data is, they just buy big data sets. They'll just go and acquire them. And I agree. It just seems pretty clear, like you should not be allowed to go and to some big data set provider and say like, you're only going to sell that data to me. I don't see any good reason to I think that could be anti-competitive for sure. What I was referring to, and I think this is the broader trend, I don't know, it's like there's a lot more businesses that do something else, which is what I call data-enabled learning. So that's different. I'm not going to buy the data. What I'm doing is I'm serving a lot of customers. By virtue of serving customers, I can observe their behavior, especially if it's software-enabled products. And then because of that behavior, I can take the data, I can process it using machine learning. I can figure out what the customers are doing, what they like, and I can basically feed that back into my product and improve the product over time. So this creates this self-reinforcing loop where the more customers I have, the more data, therefore the product gets better, therefore I can get more customers. So this is the one I think a lot of people worry. I think most people worry about this. We say, well, you get something like Google search. Well, it's certainly true for Google search. The more searches they provide, well, the better it gets. And it's very hard to compete with Google search. I totally agree. And Microsoft has learned that with Bing. It's very, very difficult. But my point is, in a lot of cases, you can point to lots of cases. You would have looked at this market over time to say, okay, well, this is done. And it turns out there's lots of startups, trying to work around it. Actually, Nielsen is probably a good example. I don't know that very well, but as far as I understand, there's lots of other sources of data today that basically make the value of Nielsen data a lot lower than it used to be. So there's lots of startups basically providing CPG companies, for example, with data from other sources. And I think in some degree, it's probably even more reliable or more targeted than what Nielsen can provide. So, I think over time, there's always, my point is over time, there's disruption even to the largest data aggregators. Actually, the other example that I know quite well is so credit bureaus. This is Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. If there was ever a data aggregator business where you think, okay, well, this is an oligopoly of three companies and they've been dominant for a while. So it is true, they've been dominant for a while, but I've done consulting for one of them, and I can tell you they're very, very worried that they're being disrupted. So one of the biggest disruptors in this space is a company called Credit Karma, which I think it went public. I mean, at this point, so it's like 10 years old or something, and they're doing it really well. So they've built basically a data business on top of Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax, and there's basically they're providing a lot better data services than the underlying bureaus are providing. So again, this is another example where like you can get, I mean, even the most entrenched data business can get disrupted.
Andre, your comments, which I think are really helpful, remind me that I wanted to comment briefly about predatory pricing, because one naturally begins to think, at least in my part of the world, if someone's offering something for free, maybe this is part of a predatory pricing strategy. And I think your comments and other comments I've made myself point out that there are a lot of strategies that are pro-competitive that involve free at some point in the strategy. So, and furthermore, we're in a lot of worlds with data where the world is very dynamic and things are changing. So the idea that you would take a hit by offering something at a loss in order to hopefully predate years down the road, to me, is a hard idea to fathom. I actually believe there is predatory pricing, but it's very rare. And I think we need to be very, very careful before we jump in and say, look, someone is pricing below cost, therefore we're going to have a presumption of predation. My own personal view is that predation is not so rare. It's predatory pricing that's rare. That is, if you're lining up a bunch of strategies that you think might help you to predate, to drive someone else out of business or harm them substantially, cutting price wouldn't be at the top of your list because it's a very costly way to predate. So, so I do think that as we learn about these new strategies of the kind you described, we do have to be very wary that we don't jump in and make a presumption of a competitive problem.
I totally agree. I mean, I think even in cases where like you're very tempted to think predation. I think it's always. I'm sure there are examples. I agree. There's some examples, but a lot of the times, if I think from a business strategy perspective, I mean, it's a very risky strategy unless I can identify. I can say this is the only competitor I have. This is the only competitor I'll ever have, and maybe I can drive them out of business. Otherwise, it's very risky. There's no guarantee. Like there's other competitors that you can't see. So the idea that you can sort of like, I can predate for a bit and then I'm done. I can raise prices. I think it's very risky.
Yeah. Hey, Dan, I want to stay with the free goods subject for a second. You wrote a widely read article on free goods and antitrust a little while ago. First question relates to a comment you made in your opening remarks about sort of state laws and consumer protection issues. And when you were talking earlier about free goods, some of the issues you described, you know, the non-existent free lunch where a consumer may think they're getting something for free, but they're not, or the question of free goods resulting implicitly and perhaps not obviously to the consumer in a lowering of quality. How do we distinguish, or how do we tell when those issues raise antitrust questions of market power and exclusion versus potentially other regulatory issues like consumer deception? Because some of the things that seem to be going on in the pricing world might seem more to relate at times to deception than to actual creation of market power.
I was afraid you'd ask me that question, Mark, because there is no easy answer, at least in my mind. As I say, I think one needs to not draw any simple conclusions until one delves deeply into the nature of the pricing practice. And I actually think it's helpful to understand the motivations of the practice. Why was it put into effect? What was the game plan? And often that will reveal whether there is an antitrust problem or maybe a consumer protection problem. I mean, an example I think I wrote about in my article that I thought about more recently, just because of some cases I've been involved in, is the newspaper business. The daily newspapers are in significant financial trouble generally. It's very hard to get people to buy and read papers. You have to be apparently over a certain age before you're willing to do that. So I'm in the rare group of people who actually does read the paper every day, the physical paper, as well as going online. So a lot of the existing newspapers have a combined strategy where they make some money by selling subscriptions, but they also actually make money by having arrangements on the web and get money through advertising. And so when you look at that kind of strategy, part of what they're doing in some cases is actually giving physical papers away for free to make money on ads. And now we're sort of in the world where we've got a two-sided market, which we haven't talked about so far, but everyone knows has become quite important. And so you'll often see in two-sided markets, one side of the market where something is free or nearly free. And it doesn't mean you get a free ride to just say, oh, it's a two-sided market and therefore it's got to be legal. I think the American Express case oversimplified that. But nevertheless, it sort of signals that we ought to take a really hard look. And maybe in taking a hard look, we'll find that there's certain groups of consumers who are really concerned about, who are otherwise injured and should be protected under the consumer protection laws. I think that's fine. What I'm wary about is making a presumption that something is anti-competitive just because it's price below cost per se.
Another question on free goods, Dan, for you, and really, Andre, for both of you. If we observe in the marketplace that the sort of nominal zero pricing model seems very attractive to consumers in a lot of instances, we would expect that competitors will see that and will replicate it and will compete to offer similar approaches to consumers, maybe in the same space, maybe in a different space. And if that's generally something we would expect to see, this goes back again to distinguishing anti-competitive and pro-competitive. And so if you had, say, Dan, a firm that did have some market power, your very sensible kind of starting point for really being very worried about any of these strategies. And you see that firm using an approach in a way that you could imagine could increase their share and ultimately perhaps make it more difficult for rivals to grow and compete. But if you also see other smaller rivals in the space using the same business model, what do we do with that? Can we draw any conclusions about whether, and absent the emails, which I think you and others are increasingly looking to kind of documents to help us understand these complexities, because they're one of the few ways we can tell. But how do you distinguish positive and negative if both the large, potentially dominant firm and the other rivals are doing the same thing?
I was hoping that Andre would answer that question because I don't have an easy answer. I actually, the Google Bing example might be a good one. I mean, Google's position is that Bing has sufficient access to information, and the reason they're not successful is they just have a lower quality product, but it's not necessarily related to data. Microsoft's response would be, well, that's too simple. It turns out that for unusual events that people are searching out at the tail of the distribution, so to speak, Microsoft's at a disadvantage. Now, whether those arguments are true or not is something I really don't have a deep understanding about. But it does suggest there's a possible antitrust issue there, but I'm quite skeptical myself. Because again, the data you get from search is if you have a search model, you're going to get a lot of data, and it's not clear to me that there's a restriction that raises a competition problem. But I know Microsoft feels quite differently about that, and so we'll see battles. But I look back at the battles that IRI and Nielsen have had over the years with respect to supermarket data. And they were battling it out in litigation and other ways and engaging with all kinds of practices, some involving free, some not. In the end, I actually don't think there was much there. I think from a competition point of view, both firms would have their ups and downs. And so I'm actually known as a pretty aggressive enforcer, but I'm very wary about jumping in without doing a lot of homework. I think we need to delve deeply. I think we understand the kind of pricing models that Andre was talking about as a starting point, and then try to think deeply as to what their implications are. So nowadays we have a lot of work. Those of us who are in the teaching business have a lot of training to do because we have to have our students understand these models and then think about the policy implications. It's a big charge.
So go ahead, Andre, and then I'll.
Yeah, I was just gonna
follow up.
on the question, like if you observe the practice being, so if you see the practice being used both by the incumbent and the startups, I mean, I think it certainly lowers the probability that this is something specifically done by the incumbent to, to kill the entrant. So I think it certainly lowers the chance that this is something anti-competitive. Now, what you guys mentioned earlier, which is like, well, there's another category of practices which probably should look at, but more from a consumer protection standpoint. So it actually reminded me of the Uber example I gave earlier. So what if like Uber and Lyft, they engage in this practice where they say, oh, like, pay us $100 a month, we'll give you a 15% discount. And actually, like, because they control price, no one can verify that there's a 15% discount. Maybe they don't give you a discount at all. I certainly think that should be investigated. It's like basically it's almost like that's like fraud, right? It's like pay me $100 and I tell you like you get 15% discount relative to a price that you don't know. So yeah, I think that falls into the consumer protection stuff.
Yeah.
So here's some food for thought. Suppose you analyze the pricing practices of some of these companies, and you find that that there's a less restrictive alternative. That there's a strategy that's likely to generate the same level of profits and expectation, but it doesn't have the potential for restriction that would be harmful to competition. Should that be something that should enter a debate? And should we take a harder look when we say, look, we don't think this particular strategy has any particular advantage except for the fact that it may be exclusionary? I think that's a fair question to ask, but it's a very difficult question. And
yeah, I
the
think
risk is that you'll harm a practice which is pro-competitive.
Yeah, I think that one, like this is one like I really think would be very like I would question like the ability for anyone from the outside to be able to suggest to the business like, hey, like here's a pricing strategy that might achieve the same. I think that's very unrealistic. Again, I totally agree. There's some practices that should be investigated, but not like, okay, here's a different pricing practice that you might consider. It's like we should look if I mean, there's some practices where you might say, okay, well, there's this clearly identifiable competitor, like say Amazon versus diapers.com. And, it's plausible that there might be predation. Let's just take a closer look. Let's look at the documents. But I don't think like regulators or anyone from the outside would have any ability to go in and like actually like evaluate the business part of the pricing. I mean, it's just like these things are so hard and so complex, and I mean the businesses are doing everything they can to figure it out, and most of the time they can't really figure it out themselves.
And we are in a dynamic world, as we both agreed. Mark, do you have an answer to the question you posed us?
Oh, I mean, I guess I'd agree with Andre that if you see others doing it, it isn't supportive of the idea that it's primarily for exclusion. On the other hand, I would say that we know there are practices like exclusive dealing that could be problems when done by a large incumbent, and they're not competitive problems if done by small rivals. I mean, the exact same practice is problematic if done with a firm with market power, and possibly even pro-competitive if a smaller firm uses it. So I'm not sure it answers the question, but I think I agree with the direction of both of your answers, for what that's worth.
Yeah, and I guess a quick follow-on, Andre, for you is, have you seen a firm's pricing strategies take into account any antitrust risk, where they've actually discussed this directly, that says, well, wait a minute, we're not sure about this? Or is it simply that the pro-competitive effects of pricing and moving to zero-based pricing or taking an aggressive pricing posture force them into it? Is it more competition than antitrust?
So honestly, it's not like I worked with that many companies to have seen this. So I think this would certainly, I'm sure this is on the mind of the large tech companies, right? In some situations. I think for startups, like they couldn't care less. It's like, they're probably thinking like the day that we have to worry about antitrust, like we should be celebrating, because that means we're so, yeah, exactly. That means like this is the kind of like luxury problem that we would love to have.
Yeah, got it. Got it. So let's handle one more topic that both of you actually touched on in your opening remarks: bundling, unbundling, and mini bundling. What you discussed, Andre, and then the Microsoft browser example that you gave, Dan. Just on a footnote, I was at Berkeley at the time when half of the Berkeley faculty was working for the DOJ and the other half of the Berkeley faculty were working for Microsoft on this. And it was truly an interesting seminar, Oliver Williamson seminar. We would have different speakers talk about the pro or anti-competitive role of this. So it was a remarkable time to be there. But
yeah, there
so
are
Dan,
a few of my Berkeley colleagues whose names I won't mention that really
exactly. Some of my dissertation advisors. So but you've argued bundling can create entry barriers because these new entrants will need to enter two markets instead of one. Now, Andre, your research suggests that bundling might actually provide some benefits, which you've sort of elaborated on in your initial discussions, but to both consumers and firms. Can you sort of provide a little more context on that? And then Dan, maybe you provide your thoughts on what Andre said.
Sure. So I think the interesting, the way to sort of try to bridge the two is the following. If you look at so I mean the type of bundling I was talking about is in the same market, right? So let's say it's like bundling of movies or TV shows by Netflix, or it'd be like something like Masterclass, which bundles like a certain type of content. So those are clearly in the same market. Now that's very different from, say, bundling the operating system and the browser, because we think, well, those are two different markets. Now here's the difficulty. It looks like two different markets at some point in time. Again, like they had mentioned, like things are dynamic. Tomorrow it may not be. And I think in a lot of cases, what these tech firms recognize is, listen, like these markets are converging. We should actually get ahead of this. And the pro-competitive reason is very simple. Our customers demand it. Like they just want more like they want to keep things simple. Like why should these products be separate? I mean, I'm sure you can think of lots of examples with the smartphone, where like the smartphone acquired a bunch of functionalities. Well, I don't know, it used to be like a separate product or a separate market, but now we think of this as just a feature of the smartphone. And by the way, I think it's for the better, because again, it makes the operating system / smartphone, it makes it more useful. It's more convenient, and then you can build like other things. Like there's more innovation that can come on top of it. But yeah, in the short run, you're thinking, oh my God, we're like, there's this large firm is bundling, like it's two different markets, and you're making it that much harder. Again, I can see that argument, but I think it's important to realize like there's also sort of the dynamic convergence of market argument that goes the other way.
So I'll jump in. Antitrust has a difficult time dealing with these kinds of bundling issues. The antitrust, the US v. Microsoft case, in my view, was easy, not easy to prosecute, but easy in the sense that the giving away the free browser passed what we call a no economic sense test. It clearly, by Microsoft's own admission, was not a sensible policy. They were only doing it for anti-competitive purposes. But generally speaking, the appellate court made it clear that practices that involve bundling, tying, slightly different but similar idea, are evaluated as some kind of a balancing test. And economists like to think that they can do that kind of balancing well, but the fact of the matter is the economists can't do it terribly well, and courts really struggle with it. So now we're in a world where we're seeing a lot of practices that have to be balanced because they're pro-competitive reasons to engage in the practice, as well as potential harms. It's a really difficult world. And then just quickly, the other case I happen to be involved with is a good example, and that was the famous bundled rebate case brought against 3M. And I happen to be consulting with 3M on the class case that followed the initial trial. So I'm not a neutral observer, and I've written about it. But my own view was that that despite what the court concluded, it was not at all clear that the bundled rebates that 3M gave were anti-competitive. And what struck me about it was that in our discussion of class certification, where I was talking to the judge and testifying, I pointed out to the judge that one of the major members of the putative class that were harmed I think it was Staples, if I remember correctly, it actually submitted support on behalf of 3M because Staples thought these bundle practices were terrific for its customers. So to me, that's a great example of a very difficult case and a ruling that I've written about and described as very problematic. So in a way, US v. Microsoft is kind of an outlier because it fit the no economic sense test, but most practices don't.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So Dan, because again, you've had a lot more exposure, like you've observed this like over time more than I have. So as far as I understand, so for example, is bundling browsers today, like say on the iPhone or Android, I mean, is that like investigated or is that illegal? It's not, right?
I have no reason to think that would be legal today. The world of browsers has changed
Yeah,
significantly.
so I think so it's true, right? I mean, again, it may have looked like that. I mean, I guess we have the documents at the point, but it's interesting that afterwards it said, well, if I get a device, it better come with a browser, right? I mean, as long as I'm not preventing you from installing other browsers if you want to.
Yeah.
That's generally true, yes. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I'm gonna shift gears, but just on that point, I was going to ask a question, and I think Andre sort of preempted it, which was if Microsoft had been able to go directly to a bundled browser in their operating system, and skipped over the two separate products being sort of forced into a bundle, wouldn't they have escaped the problem? Even though it might have had an identical effect on competitors, they would have had an integrated product that consumers liked, and DOJ might have been left with no robust theory or remedy. That's kind of where I think the gist of Andre's comments go, Dan, but I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Well, I think that would likely eliminate the tying claim, which was, as you know, was appealed in anyway, and probably I think actually would have led to a revision of the Jefferson Parish, the key case in this area. But I don't think that would have eliminated the problem if that was the only thing going on, because there are a lot of other practices that Microsoft engaged in that I think also accumulated to a Section 2 violation. So that's getting a little bit into the weeds. But yes, it would change, because in order to lay out a tying claim, we believed we had to show a separate product. And by your definition, there wouldn't be a separate product.
So I guess shifting gears for a second, in your comments, you both, I think, have alluded to your teaching roles and what is or needs to be communicated to your students, particularly your business students. And I guess the question is, and of course, Dan, you've dealt a lot with and have been an enforcer. And so the question is really looking at these two worlds of business leaders and business strategists on the one hand and antitrust enforcers on the other. And the, I don't know, complementary or conflicting roles they play, they certainly interact a lot and affect each other. My question is really, how well does each community understand the other? How well do students, the best trained students, or those who've come out and been in business for a while, how well do business leaders understand the regulatory environment that they're operating in? And at the same time, how well do antitrust enforcers understand the people they're trying to enforce the law against?
So can I give you a short answer to this one, Mark? So I have an example from last night. So I remember I told you I was teaching last night the MBA class, and I'm talking about Uber and Lyft. So the example of Uber and Lyft and why it's very difficult for them to get loyalty from customers. And I was trying to push students from business strategy to say, okay, well, what can you do if you're Uber and Lyft, because you're bleeding money, like you need to try to get like some customer loyalty. And I think one of the students said, well, they should just agree to keep the prices higher.
I saw that one coming, Andre.
Oh my God. This is like, it's one of those like, come on, like, so again, it's not my role to teach, it's not my class, but I mean, I guess like I would always assume that MBAs would like learn somewhere that they're like, there's some like basic antitrust training.
I have my own example. It goes back in time, but I got a call from an important institution that thought it was paying too much for certain products and basically wanted to organize a buyer cartel. And this individual was shocked when I told them that such a buyer cartel would be per se illegal, and that I would not meet with him or attend any meetings unless we had appropriate outside counsel who could explain exactly what arises with buyer cartels or joint ventures. He had no knowledge whatsoever of this. So we have a lot of work to do, both Andre and I guess, in terms of educating our students to see the whole picture. I think that's really true.
John, we've got a few questions. Do you want to turn to those?
No, I do. But first, I want to rebut what Dan and Andre just said about all the work they've got to do to educate students. At Georgetown, we've already done all this. So just so you know, we pretty well straightened it all out here. Let me interject one really quick question / observation. Then I want to turn to some questions that we've got from the audience. This harkens back to the predatory pricing discussion we had. And of course, the notion of predatory pricing is that you observe a price below cost. In the case of free goods, the price actually goes to zero. And Dan, your article in the Antitrust Law Journal really sort of triggered this thought in my mind, is that there is really something maybe very special and distinct about a price of zero that consumers over in the behavioral world just really like. They really, really like something that is free. And one of the examples you gave is that of a set of people in an experiment that were given a choice for a firm that was offering two goods, each with a 50% discount, or alternatively, one of the goods had no discount and the other good was offered for free. And which did consumers prefer? And they just overwhelmingly preferred the situation where one of the goods was discounted to zero. So I guess in that instance, what it suggested to me is that if consumers affirmatively really, really like a price of zero, then firms in pursuit of the patronage of customers are going to be driven to offer those prices. Is that a fair inference? And might there be something special about the price of zero?
I agree with that, John. I think that's a fair description. And it's one reason why seeing something for free for me would not immediately trigger the thought that there's an anti-competitive action here. It would trigger the natural thought of an economist to say, where's the cost? Because nothing is truly free. But that searching for where the cost is doesn't mean you have a presumption of illegality. And as I said before, I'm actually suspicious of most predatory pricing cases. I can give you examples, counterexamples, where I thought the pricing clearly was predatory, but I think it's quite unusual. And we don't want to, I don't see any reason to stop business from being creative and coming up with strategies that happen to involve free. I think that's perfectly fine.
Okay. Let me turn to a question from the audience. Let's see here. First, Eric Olish from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission asked a question that is sort of salient here, and that is, he observes that any reduction in pricing transparency makes detection of anti-competitive pricing more difficult. Is it in the public interest for regulators to insist on more transparent pricing to allow for enforcement, or does this excessively intrude on the private market transactions? Your thoughts to both of you, I guess.
It's an interesting one. So I think it's a very good question, especially in a world where a lot of the pricing, like in many cases, the pricing is done by algorithms, right? So the companies might say, well, listen, like, I mean, for example, Uber, like, we can't just like hand over to you like the pricing, or we can't just reveal the pricing minute by minute because that's part of our competitive advantage. So I definitely see, like, I think forcing them to make it transparent seems pretty extreme. Something that sort of like an intermediate step that I guess I've proposed in another context. So, which is, I guess it's Amazon, whether or not they steer buyers and, you know, with their algorithm towards their own product unfairly versus third-party product. So I've seen this proposal that has been offered in that context, which I think might work with pricing as well, is not forcing them to disclose, but basically saying you should provide an API such that approved approved third parties, like say regulators or researchers, can go in and can use the API to go and investigate, or can go and look at the pricing patterns in this case, and I guess whatever the algorithm does. So it's some sort of like some form of like audit of what the pricing algorithm does. But I'd be very uncomfortable like saying you should absolutely like forcing them to completely reveal the pricing minute by minute in context in which pricing is done by algorithms.
Well, for me, just adding into that, for me, there's a distinction as to whether we're in a world where there's active regulation, and presumably there's regulation for good reasons. There are market failures that require active regulation, and there, I think there's a pretty good argument for transparency, because you want the regulator to be able to work as effectively as possible. A lot of the markets we've been talking about today don't fit that description. They're not. These are what I sometimes describe as a wild west, where we're seeing lots of new companies coming up and being highly innovative. And I think Andre and I both agree one needs to be very wary about imposing rules. But if we're talking about at least certain parts, for example, of the power industry, electrical power industry, where we do have regulations appropriately, then I think transparency makes sense.
Agreed.
Let me quickly turn to a question from Quentin Q from Emory University. And he asks about your responses or reactions to the Epic versus Apple case, and how that might work its way through the system to alter or affect the Amex decision. I realize that's a lot going on in a very short time to digest, but if either of you have thoughts on that case, now's a good time to put them out there.
Well, I need to recuse myself because I've had some involvement in the case. So I think it's at this point it's probably appropriate for me not to comment, but I'll leave it to Andre.
Well, I have an equally short answer, but different. So I haven't. So due to actually, like I have it on my agenda. I really need to read the decision and see exactly what transpired. So I haven't looked at it carefully yet. So I don't think I have anything insightful to say at this point.
Okay, I'm looking at the clock here and observing that we're right at 12:15 or so, and that exhausts our time. I will just compliment the four of you, for leading this sort of wonderful panel discussion. I think it's one you're very, very clear about your thoughts. I think it will help guide people here in Washington, both on the Hill and in the executive branch. So let me give a heartfelt thanks, Dan, to you, and Andre, to you. Mark, Jeff, thank you very much. And let me ask everyone to please stay tuned for our next Georgetown Hill. I hope they'll all be as interesting and as substantive as this one. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you for having me. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.